In glossy World War II movies, people remember only the loud names. Mention the U.S. Air War, and B-17 Flying Fortress appears instantly. Its proud silhouette glides through famous frames from Memphis Belle. Mention Germany, and people recall Stuka sirens or dominant Bf-109 fighters. But history, stripped of cinematic shine, tells a far harsher truth. The real burden of air war was not carried by those famous stars. It rested on the wings of two stubborn, ungainly, overlooked workhorses. America's consolidated B-24 Liberator and Germany's Junkers Ju-88. Placing these aircraft side by side is not comparing apples and oranges. It is comparing two reflections of survival thinking from opposing sides. Let us start with the Americans. If one number defines industrial power, it is 18,482. That is the total number of B-24s built during the war. Not the B-17, but the B-24 was America's most produced military aircraft. It still holds the record as history's most produced heavy bomber. At Ford's legendary Willow Run plant, aircraft were not built traditionally. Americans applied car factory logic directly to industrial warfare. The production line reached speeds German engineers could barely imagine. Every 63 minutes, a completed B-24 rolled off the line. The B-24 was not beautiful. Its boxy shape earned it the nickname, the Flying Box. Flying it felt like wrestling a heavy truck without power steering. But it was everywhere. From leveling European cities to closing the Atlantic air gap. There, it hunted U-boats and protected Allied supply lifelines. The B-24 embodied the American philosophy of overwhelming numbers and reach. Across the battle lines, Germany had no Willow Run equivalent. Resources were scarce, and old aircraft could not be discarded easily. Their answer was the Junkers Ju-88, and roughly 15,000 to 16,000 Ju-88s were built. It became Germany's most produced twin-engine bomber of the war. If the B-24 was a specialized giant, the Ju-88 was a worn multi-tool. Originally designed as a fast bomber meant to outrun fighters, war forced it to constantly change roles and identities. When precision strikes were needed, dive breaks turned it into a Stuka. When British bombers attacked at night, it gained radar and upward guns. It became the Luftwaffe's most dangerous night fighter. In the Reich's final desperation, explosives filled its fuselage. The Ju-88 became the unpiloted flying bomb known as Mistel. No airframe in history carried so many tragic roles. The comparison between B-24 and Ju-88 reveals a deeper conflict. Industrial mass production versus extraordinary technical adaptability. One side crushed enemies with numbers. The other survived through engineering flexibility under constant shortage. Both were silent backbones that shaped history's most brutal war. Strip away the aluminum skin of the B-24 and Ju-88. You find two completely opposite engineering worlds underneath. One chases cold efficiency, flying straight and far above everything else. The other demands a medium bomber dance like a deadly ballet performer. The B-24's strength and its curse lived entirely in its wings. Consolidated gambled everything on David Davis's radical wing design. Unlike the thick, broad wings of the B-17, the B-24s were thin. They were long, narrow, and built with a very high aspect ratio. Aerodynamically, the design was brilliant. Laminar airflow reduced drag and boosted speed dramatically. the B-24 reached roughly 290 to 300 miles per hour at full power. It could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs on short missions. In raw performance, it clearly surpassed the B-17. If these wings turned the B-24 into a true long-distance freight hauler. It flew farther, faster, and heavier than almost any contemporary bomber. But in war, efficiency often demands a deadly price. The thin Davis wing became the B-24's Achilles heel. A direct hit on the main wing spar was often catastrophic, where a B-17 limped home with massive holes. The B-24 often broke apart. Wing failure had horrifying consequences for the crew. The aircraft would enter a violent spin under extreme G-forces. Crewmen were pinned inside, unable to reach escape hatches. The nickname "flying" or "coffin" was not earned by accident. Ditching at sea was equally dangerous. The fuselage frequently shattered and sank within moments. Survival rates were far lower than those of the B-17. And yet the B-24 also carried a stroke of genius. Its roll-up bomb bay doors were unlike anything else. Instead of swinging open, they slid upward inside the fuselage. Drag stayed low, even during bomb runs. This also solved clearance issues caused by the tricycle landing gear. On the opposite side, the Ju-88 reflected a dangerous obsession. Luftwaffe leadership believed every bomber must dive bomb. This fixation was driven largely by Ernst Udet himself. Imagine forcing a city bus to perform Formula One maneuvers. That was the challenge Junkers engineers faced. The Ju-88 airframe had to endure at brutal dive stresses. It was strengthened to survive dives at 50 to 60 degrees. To make this possible, the Ju-88 used specialized systems. Dive brakes deployed under the wings to control descent speed. They gave pilots precious seconds to aim accurately. An automatic pull-out system saved countless crews. After a bomb release, it raised the nose automatically. This mattered because extreme G-forces could knock pilots unconscious. Without automation, the aircraft would simply hit the ground. The result was shocking agility for a bomber. British test reports described the Ju-88 as deeply too frustrating to intercept. Captured in 1941, Ju-88, a 6EE-205, surprised British evaluators. It maneuvered aggressively and outran the Bristol Blenheim by 40 kilometers per hour. One final, unmistakable feature was its cooling system. Despite using liquid-cooled Jumo 211 inline engines, it looked radial. An annular radiator surrounded the engine's nose. The design improved aerodynamics and simplified coolant plumbing. It gave the Ju-88 its tough, unmistakable face. If design is an engineer's promise, battlefields deliver the final judgment. Both aircraft faced their greatest glory and their deepest disasters. Here, hero and defeat were separated by a single burst of flak. No battle defines the B-24's fate more clearly than Operation Tidal Wave. It was a reckless gamble from the very start. Heavy strategic bombers were ordered to fly at treetop level. They attacked Hitler's fuel lifeline, the Ploiești oil refineries. On August 1, 1943, 177 B-24s took off from Benghazi. The plan relied on the B-24's exceptional long-range capability. But navigation errors erased the element of surprise completely. The bulky, flying trucks descended below 50 feet above ground. They flew directly into black oil smoke and point-blank flak fire. The results were catastrophic. 54 B-24s were shot down or never returned. Nearly 1/3 of the attacking force was lost. 310 airmen died in a single day. Massive B-24s were seen breaking apart and crashing in flames. Only 33 aircraft were fit to fly the following day. 5 medals of on honor were awarded for extraordinary courage. Ploiești became an unforgettable scar. It proved the B-24 was extremely vulnerable outside its intended altitude and formation. On the opposite side, the Ju-88 demonstrated its deadly effectiveness. The Allies believed the Luftwaffe in Italy was exhausted. They were badly mistaken. On December 2nd, 1943, the Ju-88s approached the port of Bari silently. 105 aircraft, mostly Ju-88, A-4S, took part. The harbor was packed with Allied supply ships. Unlike the noisy daylight raids of heavy bombers, this attack was precise. Within 20 minutes, more than 20 ships were sunk or destroyed. Tragedy deepened when the ship John Harvey was hit. It secretly carried mustard gas aboard. The gas mixed with oil fires across the harbor. More than 1,000 Allied sailors and soldiers were killed or injured. Bari port was completely paralyzed for 3 weeks. Most astonishing of all, the attackers lost only one Ju-88, for this strike perfectly reflected German tactical thinking. Fast, precise, calculated, and merciless. If Ploiești was tragedy, the Atlantic was redemption. Here, the B-24 became legendary without much recognition. A vast mid-Atlantic gap existed beyond coastal air patrol range. German U-boats slaughtered convoys inside this deadly zone. Only the very long-range B-24 could close the gap. Armor and guns were removed to carry additional fuel. These aircraft patrolled the ocean for endless hours. Their presence forced U-boats to remain submerged. Submerged? Their submarines were slow and nearly blind. B-24s are credited with sinking or helping sink 93 U-boats. Not the B-17 or Lancaster, but the B-24 ended the Wolfpack threat. It kept the Allied supply lifeline between America and Britain alive. In 1940, the Ju-88's debut was deeply disappointing. It was advertised as a fast Wonder bomber, nearly immune to fighters. Reality proved far harsher. Although faster than Do-17S and He-111S, it was still vulnerable. Spitfires and Hurricanes could intercept it reliably. Between July and October 1940, the 303 Ju-88s were lost. Losses exceeded those of He-111S and Do-17S. Early versions lacked sufficient defensive firepower and armor. Pilots also struggled with its complex, fighter-like handling. These losses forced urgent upgrades in weapons and protection. The Ju-88 emerged tougher, humbler, and far more resilient afterward. War does not allow rigidity. When conditions change, weapons must adapt or disappear. This is where both aircraft proved their true core value. Their airframes were flexible enough to abandon original bombing roles. When daylight became deadly under Allied fighter dominance, Ju-88 found darkness. It was no longer a dive bomber. The night became its true kingdom. The CR and especially G variants transformed Ju-88 completely. They became Nazi Germany's most feared night fighters. Look at the Ju-88 G1 and G6 variants. The glass bomber nose was removed entirely. It was replaced by a solid metal nose packed with electronics. Liechtenstein radar antennas sprouted outward like antlers. These included Fuge 202, Fuge 212, and later SN2 systems. The weapon British crews feared most wasn't forward-firing guns. It was schräge Musik, or jazz music. German engineers mounted 20mm cannons on the aircraft's upper fuselage. The guns fired upward at roughly a 70-degree angle. Ju-88s slipped beneath British bombers into an undefended blind spot. They tore open bomber bellies without victims ever realizing the attack. These aircraft created the great aces of the night war. Helmut Lent scored 100 night victories, totaling 110 kills. Prince Heinrich zu Sein-Wittgenstein achieved 87 confirmed victories. They outmastered Ju-88 tactics against Lancaster and Halifax formations. Ju-88 also delivered one of the war's greatest intelligence coups. On May 9, 1943, Ju-88R1 landed in Scotland. Aircraft D5+EV was deliberately defected by Heinrich Schmidt and crew. They delivered an intact, secret Liechtenstein BC radar system. Thanks to this aircraft, Allied scientists learned German radar weaknesses. Electronic countermeasures were developed, saving thousands of Allied airmen. That Ju-88 still survives today in the RAF Museum. In the war's final days, Ju-88's transformation became pure desperation. This was the Mistel Project, meaning mistletoe. Old Ju-88 airframes had cockpits removed completely. They were filled with a massive, explosive charge. The warhead weighed 3,800 kilograms. It contained hexogen mixed with TNT. A fighter aircraft was mounted on top for guidance. This was usually a BF-109 or FW-190, though the pilot guided the composite weapon toward bridges or ships. He detached at the last moment before impact. It was a tragic image of a great machine turned into suicide weaponry. If Ju-88 hid in darkness, some B-24s did the opposite. They tried to become as visible as possible. These were called assembly ships. Forming massive bomber formations over foggy England was chaos. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of bombers had to assemble mid-air. To solve this, Americans used worn-out B-24s. All guns and armor were removed. They were painted in outrageous colors. On huge polka dots, zebra stripes, and bright neon patterns. These aircraft became airborne beacons. They were nicknamed Judas Goats. They guided bomber groups into formation. Then they turned back before entering enemy airspace. But the most dangerous B-24 role was not bombing or guiding. It was hauling fuel. The C-109 variant was converted into a flying fuel tanker. Its mission was resupplying B-29 bombers in China. These flights crossed the Himalayan route known as the Hump. Turrets and armor were removed to reduce weight. The fuselage was packed with massive fuel tanks. Our total fuel capacity reached 2,900 gallons. That is nearly 11,000 liters of fuel. Flying over the world's highest mountains was already dangerous. Doing it in an unstable aircraft full of sloshing fuel was lethal. C-109S were extremely unstable during takeoff and landing. One small mistake could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Pilots described flying the C-109 as lifelong terror. B-24s also flew secret missions under Operation Carpetbagger. These aircraft were painted completely black. They flew alone at very low altitude during night missions. They dropped OSS agents and weapons into occupied Europe. But whether a cold night hunter like Ju-88 with antlers on its nose or a brightly painted guide like the B-24, both aircraft proved one truth of war. Survival depends not only on firepower. It depends on the ability to adapt to unimaginable missions. War is not only numbers like wingspan, horsepower, or bomb load. In the end, it always returns to human lives trapped inside aluminum cages. Men were suspended between life and death at several thousand meters. Aircraft design shaped combat ability. It also shaped how crews lived and how they died. American pilots said flying a B-17 felt like dancing with a cooperative lady. Flying the B-24 Liberator was a physical fight. Film legend Jimmy Stewart did not only play pilots on screen, he lived that life. As commander of B-24 Group's 445th and later 453rd, Stewart flew for combat. He completed 20 official combat missions, plus many unofficial ones. Crewmen who flew with him described the struggle clearly. The B-24 demanded real physical strength to control. Its control systems were heavier and far less forgiving than the B-17s. Holding tight combat box formation drained pilots completely. They fought turbulent air from hundreds of nearby aircraft. Pilots were soaked in sweat, even in freezing outside temperatures. But the B-24's true horror came at the end. The story of Louis Zamperini proves the Liberator's deadly fragility. Zamperini flew aboard a B-24D named Green, Sir Hornet. On May 27, 1943, the aircraft flew a rescue mission. Mechanical failure sent it crashing into the Pacific Ocean. Unlike the B-17, this which could float briefly like a boat, the B-24 usually broke apart on hard water impact. Its thin Davis wing and fuselage design worked against survival. The Green Hornet hit the water nose first and snapped in half. 8 of 11 crewmen were pulled down instantly. Zamperini survived. He endured 47 days adrift on a life raft. He faced sharks, starvation, and dehydration. He was eventually captured by Japanese forces. His story reminds us of the B-24's cruel truth. The aircraft could carry you farther than any other. But when it fell, it rarely offered a second, a chance. On the opposite side, Ju-88 crews shared a different experience. It unfolded inside a tight, intimate, dangerous cockpit. This was the Beetle's Eye cockpit. Unlike Allied bombers where crews sat far apart, Junkers engineers grouped all 4 crewmen together. Pilot, bomber, radio operator, and mechanic gunner sat side by side. They shared a faceted glass nose compartment. The design aimed to strengthen combat brotherhood. Crewmen could see each other. They could touch each other. They could support each other, be under fire. But this closeness was a double-edged blade. Placing everyone inside a glass cage increased vulnerability. A single direct hit could kill the entire crew instantly. A 20mm shell or accurate machine gun burst was enough. British fighters often shattered the multifaceted glazing. Life and death of all 4 men were tightly bound together. No other bomber crew shared fate so completely. Pilot Peter Stahl of KG-30 recorded this psychological journey. His diary, The Diving Eagle, captured the emotional collapse. He described early war confidence and arrogance. Ju-88s once, but dominated Northern Europe and the Mediterranean. Later entries revealed deep despair in 1944 and 1945. Stahl wrote of dive-bombing missions and tense night shipping hunts. He described flying worn Ju-88s against overwhelming Allied air power. Each takeoff felt like a pre-announced death sentence. Whether wrestling controls inside the cold B-24 cockpit or sharing fate inside the cramped Ju-88 nose, both aircraft demanded sacrifices beyond imagination. When the guns fell silent in 1945, out of the skies finally grew quiet again. Shattered aluminum wreckage stretched from French fields to Pacific coral islands. Looking back at the B-24 Liberator and Junkers Ju-88 journeys, we see more than aircraft history. We see two opposing industrial systems and military mindsets. They ultimately shaped the outcome of World War II. History can feel dry, but these numbers are genuinely staggering. The consolidated B-24 Liberator totaled 18,482 aircraft. It remains the most produced American military aircraft in history. It also became the backbone bomber of the Allied Air Forces. The B-24 embodied the Acrobatic, an industrial flood America unleashed upon the Axis. Across the front lines, Junkers Ju-88 production reached 15,000 to 16,000 aircraft. Depending on sources, it became Germany's most produced twin-engine bomber. Maintaining such output amid bombing and material shortages was remarkable. It stood as a technical achievement of German industry under extreme pressure. The B-24's greatest legacy was never beauty or public fame. That spotlight usually belonged to the B-17. Yes, its true strength was reach. Thanks to the efficient Davis Wing and Willow Run production lines, the B-24 achieved what no other aircraft could. It reached deep into the Atlantic to close the mid-Atlantic gap. German U-boats once slaughtered convoys freely in that space. It also carried war to Japan's doorstep across unimaginable Pacific distances. The B-17 could not operate there due to fuel limits. The B-24 won because it was everywhere. Its numbers were large enough to absorb losses and continue forward. In contrast, the Ju-88 left a legacy of brilliant adaptability. From a single original design, German, art engineers reshaped it repeatedly. It became whatever the Luftwaffe needed at any given moment. When precision dive bombing was required, the Ju-88 delivered. When anti-tank firepower was needed, it carried heavy cannons. When night interception became essential, it became Germany's best night fighter. When desperation peaked, it turned into the Mistel suicide weapon. The Ju-88 proved how exceptional airframe design could carry an air force. It served from the war's opening days to its bitter end. If the B-24 Liberator was American industry's sledgehammer, massive, or standardized, and crushing through sheer weight, then the Ju-88 was German engineering's pocket knife. Sharp, flexible, and capable in almost any situation. Both were silent workhorses carrying the weight of the skies. Together, they wrote aviation history's most tragic and defining chapters.